At precisely 7:42 p.m., the glass doors of the Lancaster Grand slid open, and in stepped Daniel Whitaker, polished, composed, and cloaked in quiet power. His tailored navy suit shimmered faintly under the chandelier light, but it wasn't his appearance that drew stares. It was the moment he handed over his American Express Centurion card, the elusive black card, to the front desk. Without hesitation, the clerk named Ethan sneered and scoffed, probably maxed out loud enough to catch the attention of everyone in the marble-floored lobby. The insult hit like a slap, not just to Daniel, but to the very concept of dignity in a world obsessed with appearances. What no one in that lobby knew was this: Daniel wasn't just another guest. He was a senior director at Dominion Ventures and the lead auditor overseeing a $2.8 billion expansion deal, one that the Lancaster Grand desperately needed. With a flick of disdain, they had mocked the very man who could crumble their empire with a single email. This wasn't just a moment of poor service. It was the beginning of the hotel's reckoning. Before we dive into this story of arrogance and collapse, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. The echo of Ethan's words, probably maxed out, still lingered in the air as Daniel Whitaker gently slid the Centurion card back into his wallet. His face betrayed no emotion, no scowl, no outrage, just a stillness that seemed strangely out of place in the chaos of insult. Ethan puffed up with smugness, barely looked at Daniel as he tapped on his keyboard, printing out the room details without making eye contact. "Room 808, Ethan said flatly. "Standard king." Daniel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had booked a premier executive suite, a room that came with its own office, full concierge privileges, and access to the executive lounge. A downgrade wasn't just an error, it was a decision, one deliberately made in front of others. Guests in line behind Daniel exchanged quiet glances, some with raised brows, others pretending not to notice but clearly watching. A bellhop approached, reaching for Daniel's carry-on, but Ethan quickly waved him off. "He's good," he said with an unspoken subtext. "He's not worth it." Daniel took the key card and turned without a word. His shoes clicked softly against the polished marble as he made his way toward the elevators, aware of every glance, every murmur. There was no anger in his stride, only intention. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he allowed himself one long breath. His reflection in the mirror-paneled walls stared back, calm, composed, and calculating. In that moment, Daniel knew exactly what had happened. This wasn't customer service gone wrong. It was a public demonstration of quiet exclusion. He had spent the last 2 months overseeing an internal equity and inclusion audit for Dominion Ventures. Lancaster Grand was one of their most prestigious clients. His job wasn't to fix appearances, it was to measure truth. And tonight they had handed it to him, raw and unfiltered, in full view of witnesses. Room 808 was exactly as he expected, smaller than promised, devoid of executive amenities, and placed near the end of a corridor where noise bled through the walls. A cleaning cart rattled nearby, accompanied by a loud exchange of employee chatter. This was not an accident. It was a clear message: you don't belong here. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and opened his laptop. One by one, he pulled up the internal files for Lancaster Grand, previous complaints, unresolved bias incidents, photos from hidden audits. He added one more entry: incident at check-in front desk clerk, Ethan verbal profiling and downgrade of VIP guest. Attached was a time-stamped recording taken from his phone, documenting the exact words Ethan had used. He didn't have to argue with the hotel. Facts would do it for him. He opened a secure app used exclusively by Dominion's compliance team. Messages had already started pouring in. Jeremiah, Deputy Director. "How bad was it, Daniel?" "Worse than expected. They've made no changes since our preliminary warnings." Jeremiah, "Should we hold the final vote?" Daniel stared at the message. The final vote determined whether Dominion would proceed with a $2.8 billion expansion deal that included the Lancaster Grand as the flagship of a new luxury hotel network. His recommendation had been neutral up until now. Daniel put a hold on it. "I'll submit findings by noon." Outside his window, the city glowed. The view was beautiful, but for Daniel it was just static. He was too focused on the storm he was about to unleash. Later that night, he attempted to access the executive lounge. He had hoped briefly that perhaps the earlier incident had been a fluke, but as he scanned his room key at the lounge door, a red light blinked. Access denied. The concierge, standing just beyond the glass, made eye contact and shook his head. "Sorry, sir," he mouthed before turning his back. Daniel turned away. Not defeated, not surprised, just confirmed. He took the elevator back beyond returning to the lobby. Ethan was still at the desk laughing with another staff member. The two stopped when they saw him approaching. Daniel's presence had weight now subtle but unmistakable. He stopped just short of the counter. "Excuse me, Ethan," Daniel said, his voice quiet but piercing. Ethan straightened, unsure. "I'd like to understand," Daniel continued, "why would I have been treated like a fraud since I walked through your doors?" "I don't know what you mean," Ethan said too quickly, a defensive tone creeping in. Daniel leaned slightly forward. The card, the downgrade, the lounge, the tone. Let's not pretend it was just company policy. Sir, I don't. Daniel cut him off. "Let's skip the excuses. Because what I'm about to do doesn't require your response." He placed a business card on the counter. Black and embossed with silver lettering, Daniel Whitaker, Senior's Director, Equity Compliance, Dominion Ventures. Ethan's eyes scanned it, and a flicker of dread passed through his face. Daniel didn't wait for it to settle. He turned and walked away, leaving behind the silence of consequence. In that moment, a quiet humiliation turned into the first move of a larger plan. The kind of plan that didn't knock on doors, it dismantled them. The weight of the business card Ethan now held in his trembling hand extended far beyond its sleek design. It was more than just a title, it was a warning. And that warning had just been delivered with the same calm composure of a man who knew precisely where every string was tied and who had the power to cut them all at once. Back upstairs in room 808, Daniel sat at the desk, the light from his laptop casting a cool glow across his face. On the screen, a secure document slowly populated line by line. Every detail of his experience had already been logged, categorized, time-stamped. But what came next wasn't about recounting the incident. It was about unraveling the machine behind it. Dominion Ventures didn't just audit companies. They audited systems, hiring protocols, DEI implementation, cultural retention, behavioral algorithms in service management. Daniel wasn't just a senior director in compliance. He was the architect of Dominion's bias exposure framework, a high-level protocol used to identify, test, and break down institutional discrimination in corporate structures. He didn't make noise. He made impact. He had been placed at Lancaster Grand under the pretense of conducting a market evaluation for the chain's new flagship. But the truth buried in encrypted dispatches between Dominion executives was far more layered. Reports of customer discrimination had surfaced months earlier, unverified at the time, but consistent. That's when Daniel was sent in quietly, posing not as an inspector, but as an everyday client. And now the chain had failed the test in the most public way imaginable. He logged into Dominion's internal platform and opened the command interface for Phase 2 structural integrity testing. It was a proprietary step reserved for only the most flagrant systemic issues, when a company not only engaged in exclusionary practices, but doubled down when given the chance to correct them. Daniel clicked through archived footage, EXS logs, and interdepartmental memos from Lancaster Grand. Each one recorded via internal contacts who had quietly partnered with Dominion in exchange for future opportunities or whistleblower protection. One such contact, Ava, a night manager who had witnessed years of quiet discrimination, had already flagged Ethan in a report 2 weeks prior. Ava flagged memo: Ethan frequently makes assumptions based on guest appearance. Dismissive toward non-white clientele, often downgrades or forgets VIP perks. Management looks the other way. That memo, suppressed by the hotel's HR lead, now resurfaced in Daniel's evidence folder. At 11:13 p.m., he initiated the first formal bias escalation trigger. The email it generated was crisp and factual, directed to Dominion's Mergers and Acquisitions Oversight Team. Subject: escalation protocol. Triggered. Lancaster Grand per Phase 1 findings and direct personal testing. I recommend immediate freeze of pending expansion merger. Bias exposure framework test return negative. Evidence package forthcoming. Daniel Whitaker. The implications were massive. That email alone placed the entire $2.8 billion deal into limbo. Dominion's board would wake up the next morning to a full recommendation backed not just by ethics, but financial risk exposure and public relations forecasts. Daniel closed the tab and leaned back. Downstairs, Ethan stood motionless, still clutching the card, sweat beading under his collar. His colleague Marcy peeked over his shoulder. "Did he just say Dominion Ventures?" she whispered, eyes wide. Ethan didn't respond. Ethan, she said again, this time more urgently. That's the firm the board's been hyping. The big expansion, they're funding it. Still no response. His throat was dry, heart pounding. In his mind, he replayed every smug smirk, every dismissive comment he'd made since Daniel arrived. Not just tonight, the past few weeks, the past few years. You should say something to the manager, Marcy urged. This is bad, but it was already too late. In the back office, the night shift manager had just received a flagged alert through the hotel's internal escalation system. It wasn't from a guest complaint, it was a priority compliance message originating from Dominion Ventures itself. Notice high-risk client interaction flagged. An incident involving a senior Dominion Ventures executive has been reported. Incident involves discriminatory behavior by front desk staff and may affect pending financial partnership. Initiate damage control protocol. Senior leadership should be notified immediately. The manager's face paled. She picked up the hotel phone and punched in the private line to General Manager Colin Red. It rang 5 times before he answered with a groggy voice. This better be important, Colin muttered. It's Daniel Whitaker, she said flatly. He's Dominion, and he's filed something. There was a pause, then a sharp inhale. Do not let him check out. Keep him in the building. I'll be there in 30. She hung up, heart pounding, but Daniel wasn't waiting for anyone. Back in room 808, he removed the blazer he'd worn at check-in and folded it neatly over the chair. He changed into a black half-zip pullover, the Dominion emblem stitched discreetly on the chest, and pulled up a clean copy of the internal audit report template. The title at the top of the document glowed in bold white font against the black screen, Lancaster Grand Final Findings. Systemic Failure Report. At the bottom, his digital signature awaited only one tap. And the moment he signed, the fate of the Lancaster Grand wouldn't just shift, it would collapse. Daniel didn't press submit right away. Instead, he stared at the signature line, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This wasn't just about personal vindication. It wasn't about revenge or ego or even the humiliating smirk Ethan had worn hours earlier. This was about a culture of silence, one that had festered, calcified, and wrapped itself around every polished surface of the Lancaster Grand like rot behind marble. He tapped a few keys and unlocked access to a restricted Dominion dataset incident correlation engine. Over the last 6 months, Dominion Ventures had gathered anonymized data from over 70 luxury hotels across the country, and Lancaster Grand had surfaced in the top percentile for flagged discrimination complaints. The problem wasn't just this night, it was a pattern. The system categorized incidents by timestamp, staff ID location, guest demographics, and complaint outcomes. Daniel cross-referenced Ethan's employee ID EW2873 against this larger pattern. He found 3 other incidents logged within the last 18 months where guests with minority surnames were downgraded or denied lounge access without justification. One guest, a South Asian investment banker from Mumbai, had written, I've stayed in hotels all over the world. This is the only place where I felt like I had to prove I deserved to be there. That line hit hard. Because it wasn't about luxury, it was about dignity. Daniel added a new section to the report, Behavioral Pattern Confirmation, Employee EW22873. He attached internal system flags, previous unresolved complaints, and cross-staff testimonies from Ava, the night manager, who had quietly provided internal feedback about the culture of implicit bias. He recalled their last encrypted call. Ava's voice had been calm but heavy. I've been in hospitality 15 years, Mr. Whitaker, but this is the first place where I was told, unofficially of course, to be more visually selective at the front desk. They use coded phrases like preserve brand experience. But we both know what that means. Yes, Daniel did know, too well. He added a second tag to the report, cultural complicity, management tier 2 and above. This wasn't just a rogue staffer problem. It was deeper, systemic. Across the lobby, the atmosphere had begun to shift. The PR crisis hadn't hit the public yet, but the internal tremors had started. Marcy had been pulled aside and questioned about what she saw, what was said. Ethan had disappeared into the manager's office 20 minutes earlier. The concierge desk buzzed with confusion as reservations began mysteriously freezing. Daniel closed his laptop. He stood stretched and took a slow breath. He didn't bother calling the front desk. He didn't ask for an apology. That wasn't how this worked. He already knew what the next 48 hours would bring. Legal briefings, emergency board meetings, and desperate corporate emails beginning with words like deeply regret, unfortunate, misunderstanding, and commitment to diversity. But none of that mattered now, because the decision was made. Dominion Ventures was pulling out. The $2.8 billion expansion deal wasn't just a revenue dream for Lancaster, it was the deal they had built their next 5-year strategy around. It had promised luxury upgrades, an international rebrand, new properties across Dubai, Singapore, and New York. And now, because of one interaction, one moment of arrogance, they would lose it all. Daniel grabbed his room key, slipped his phone into his blazer pocket, and walked out of room 808. As he passed the hallway mirror, he paused. He didn't see a man who had won. He saw a man who had finally said enough. The elevator dinged open. He stepped in. Downstairs, the general manager, Colin Red, had just arrived. Disheveled, his tie loosened, and his eyes bloodshot, he rushed past stunned employees whispering behind concierge stations. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't pause. In the office, Ethan sat hunched over a chair, the earlier bravado drained from his face. Colin glanced at him, eyes narrowed. "I don't care what your intent was," he barked. "You insulted a Dominion executive. You mocked the man holding the future of this place in his hands." Ethan stammered. I, I didn't know who he was. That's the point." Colin cut him off. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Outside the office, the elevator doors opened. Daniel stepped into the lobby, his steps slow, composed, but impossible to ignore. Guests turned to watch. Staff members froze mid-task. The silence stretched thin as glass. Colin stepped out of the back hallway just in time to see him. For a long second, the two men stood across from each other. Colin stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker," Daniel raised a hand, calmly cutting him off. "You'll receive the full audit report within the hour," he said coolly. "And as of this morning, the Dominion expansion deal is no longer under consideration." A stunned hush fell over the room. "You had a chance to build something extraordinary," Daniel continued. "Instead, you built a fortress of assumptions, and now the walls are cracking." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned and walked toward the front doors, leaving behind marble floors, stunned faces, and a legacy unraveling by the minute. As the doors closed behind him, a notification pinged on Colin's phone. "Subject urgent. Dominion withdrawal statement for review. Status, publication scheduled. 10 minutes. And with that, the collapse began. The lobby had never been this quiet. For years, the Lancaster Grand had curated an atmosphere of hushed sophistication. But now the silence wasn't luxury, it was tension. Every whisper felt amplified. Every glance, every step, every breath carried weight. And in the center of it all stood Colin Red, general manager of a hotel built on image, status, and illusion, an illusion that had just shattered. He stared at the screen of his phone. The Dominion withdrawal announcement was now live. The headline read, "Dominion Ventures cancels $2.8 billion. Deal with Lancaster Grand over racial bias incident." Beneath it, a still frame from the security footage, Ethan smirking as he held Daniel Whitaker's black Centurion card in his hand. The look of condescension frozen in time. No context could soften the image. No PR firm could spin that frame into innocence. A low gasp rippled through the staff as the news began spreading like a virus. Several employees pulled out their phones discreetly, their eyes widening as they read the article. Others stood motionless, stunned as the gravity of the moment sank in. And then came the whispers. "Did you see the footage? That's the guy from room 808. Oh my God, Ethan really said that. He was the executive. Ava Morgan, assistant night manager, stood just outside the break room with her arms folded. She had seen everything from the security feed earlier, had heard Ethan's comment live, had watched Daniel's measured response. But she hadn't intervened. She told herself it wasn't her place. She told herself she was off duty. She told herself it was one more incident in a long list of incidents that wouldn't matter anyway. But now it did matter. It mattered because it was no longer just between a guest and a clerk. It was national, it was viral, it was a reckoning. And Ava knew silence had consequences too. She walked briskly toward the back office, ignoring the startled stares from front desk staff. Colin saw her coming, but didn't speak. His face was pale. "You need to let me speak to HR." Ava said, her voice controlled but urgent. Colin blinked. "Why?" "Because I have something to say," she replied. "And this time I'm not going to pretend it's not my problem." Inside the HR suite, the hotel's internal counsel was already convening with compliance officers. The room was crowded with tension, flickering monitors, folders spread across desks, frantic phone calls being placed and received. Ava stood in the doorway. "You need a witness statement." "You have one now." The room quieted. Someone motioned for her to sit. "I've worked here 5 years," she began. "And this isn't new. The profiling, the microaggressions, the unspoken rules about who gets full access and who gets managed quietly. It's all part of the culture. Why didn't you report it earlier?" a compliance officer asked, voice neutral. Ava's laugh was soft and hollow. "Because I've seen what happens to people who try. They get iced out, hours cut, promotions denied. And if you're a woman of color, you're made to feel like you're overreacting." The room fell still. She went on. "Ethan didn't act alone. He's a product of this place. The way we train staff, the way we talk about guests behind closed doors. There's a whole script we don't admit exists, but it does." Someone scribbled notes. Another typed rapidly on a laptop. Ava's voice didn't waver. Daniel Whitaker wasn't targeted because he did anything wrong. He was targeted because this hotel decided what luxury should look like. And if you didn't fit the mold, you got treated like less. Outside the HR office, the lobby remained in quiet chaos. The PR director stood near the concierge desk, barking instructions into a phone. "Delete the Instagram post. Postpone the influencer event. We're not doing anything until legal clears it." One of the interns, a young man named Miguel, scrolled through Twitter with growing horror. He'd just started 2 weeks ago, his dream job in hospitality. He loved architecture, loved the scent of the cedarwood candles in the lobby, loved telling guests where to find the best jazz bar downtown. Now he wondered if he'd made a mistake. He looked up and locked eyes with a guest, a middle-aged black couple, suitcase in hand, standing by the bellhop station. They looked uncertain, even a little uncomfortable. Miguel stepped forward. "Welcome to Lancaster Grand," he said, voice soft. "Can I help you with anything?" The woman hesitated. "We just saw the news. We're not sure we want to stay anymore." Miguel didn't offer a rehearsed smile. He didn't deflect. He said the only thing that felt real. "I understand," he said, "and I'm sorry. If you decide to leave, I'll help you find another place. If you stay, I'll do everything I can to make sure you feel safe." They didn't smile, but they nodded, because for the first time that day, someone wasn't pretending. It was business as usual. Upstairs in a suite now vacated, Daniel's luggage had already been picked up by a driver. But his presence lingered like a fault line splitting the marble foundation beneath the Lancaster Grand. And deep in the HR office, Ava finished her statement. When asked if she feared retaliation, she paused before answering. "I used to," she said, "but not anymore. Because once the silence breaks, others find their voice too." Daniel Whitaker didn't need the headlines to tell him he had made an impact. He could feel it in the silence of the boardroom. That morning, he sat across from the Dominion Ventures Advisory Committee, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a strategist executing phase 2 of a long overdue recalibration. The incident at the Lancaster Grand had simply revealed what Daniel already suspected, that the rot was systemic and deeply embedded in the culture of prestige. Behind closed doors, Daniel had been documenting behavior like Ethan's for months at banks, hotels, lounges, executive clubs. Places where access wasn't just about money, but about how one looked while spending it. But Dominion Ventures wasn't a typical firm. It was a private capital equity group with reach far beyond real estate. They controlled energy, tech, aerospace, and hospitality. And now Daniel's latest report had become the most read file in the company's global portal. Seated at the glass conference table surrounded by his peers, Daniel clicked his remote. The screen lit up with his audit results, not just Lancaster Grand, but 12 affiliated properties showing patterns of discrimination, bias, complaints, and unequal guest treatment. Each data point was cross-referenced with staff interviews, anonymous guest feedback, and security footage. "I'm not here to embarrass them," Daniel said, voice low but firm. "I'm here to hold a mirror to the model they've been hiding behind." Around the table, the other partners nodded. Melissa Tran, Dominion's chief operations officer, leaned forward. "We're not just investors anymore," she said. "We're stakeholders in how the world works, and that includes whether it works equally." Daniel's phone buzzed, a message from Ava Morgan. "I gave the statement, told them everything." You were right to push this. Thank you. He stared at it for a moment, absorbing the weight of what it meant. It wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about everyone who saw what was broken and decided to speak anyway. There's more. Daniel continued, shifting the presentation. The next slide showed internal emails from Lancaster Grand managers, jokes about guests dressed too casually for the lobby, profiling based on surnames, coded instructions on who to reconfirm bookings from. Each email was real. Each one had been recovered by Dominion's digital compliance arm. No one at the table asked for confirmation. They didn't need it. They'd seen this play out before in lawsuits and settlements and PR disasters. But Daniel had done something rare. He hadn't waited for it to escalate. He had intervened early, surgically and publicly. Melissa stood. What do you need next? Daniel didn't hesitate. Pull the rest of the funding pipeline. Not just Lancaster, all 12 linked properties. We'll reallocate those funds into equity-forward hospitality ventures. One of the younger partners frowned. Won't that trigger retaliation from the other boards? Daniel turned toward him, calm and deliberate. If they retaliate, they expose themselves. If they stay silent, they've already admitted guilt. Either way, we control the narrative now. At that moment, a new alert hit the screen. Real-time headlines from hospitality trade networks. Dominion pulls funding from Lancaster Grand over discrimination scandal. Anonymous sources confirm major equity compliance restructuring at top hotel chains. A quiet war over bias in luxury hospitality has begun, and Dominion is leading it. Daniel turned to Melissa. Schedule the press briefing. I'll handle it myself. The others nodded. There were no objections. Later that afternoon, as Daniel stepped outside Dominion's headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, a different kind of tension filled the air. Not fear, not resentment, anticipation. Because people had started watching. Not just the public, but competitors, regulators, CEOs who once ignored memos marked equity compliance. His story had gone beyond viral. It had become a case study. Business schools were already dissecting it. Hospitality chains had issued internal reviews. Even private flight networks and luxury retailers had started revising access protocols and bias training. All because of one moment at a hotel counter. As Daniel stepped into his waiting car, his assistant handed him a folder. Inside was a letter from a woman named Clarice Hensley, former head of housekeeping at Lancaster Grand. I wanted to thank you. For years we were told not to speak up, that it would cost us our jobs. But you spoke with actions, not words. And now maybe we get to work in a place that respects us too. Daniel closed the folder, quietly moved. Because hidden power doesn't just mean status or wealth. It means knowing how to turn silence into evidence, disrespect into leverage, injustice into momentum. And Daniel Whitaker, quiet, measured, deliberate, was no longer hiding his power. He was using it not to retaliate, but to realign the system from within. The next boardroom he entered wouldn't see a man simply holding a report. They would see a man carrying a movement. Inside the headquarters of Ellison Holdings, a rival firm with partial ownership in the Lancaster Grand's parent company, a storm was gathering. Emails flew like shrapnel across internal servers. Conference calls stacked on top of emergency meetings. And in the middle of it all stood Miles Eckhart, head of risk management, who had just read Daniel Whitaker's 147-page compliance report from Dominion Ventures. Every page was annotated, every figure cross-verified, every sentence impossible to dispute. What the hell were we funding? He whispered, his fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany desk. The systemic rot wasn't just isolated to one front desk clerk named Ethan or one luxury hotel in downtown Manhattan. Daniel's investigation had exposed a pattern one Ellison Holdings had silently bankrolled for years. From recruitment policies to guest handling procedures, from how complaints were filtered to how preferred guest algorithms quietly deprioritized certain demographics, it was all there. Worse, Dominion Ventures had documented it all with clinical precision. In page after page, Daniel had mapped how Lancaster Grand and its sister properties created barriers, some overt, others subtle, to keep their clientele homogenous. Wealth wasn't the gatekeeper. Perception was, and perception, when filtered through bias, became discrimination. Miles turned to the whiteboard filled with red marker diagrams. Dominion's press release had hit the wires just 30 minutes ago, and already the company's name was trending on every business platform. Dominion CEO shakes industry with audit bombshell. Is this the end of legacy, hospitality equity, is now an investment metric thanks to Whitaker. As Miles read the headlines, one thing became terrifyingly clear. Daniel wasn't trying to embarrass Lancaster. He was orchestrating a new market paradigm, one that judged brands not just by returns, but by ethics. And Ellison, they were on the wrong side of it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Miles said without turning. A junior associate entered, tablet in hand, face pale. "Sir, we just got word. 3 institutional investors are threatening to divest unless we distance ourselves from the Lancaster Grand portfolio." Miles didn't blink. "How much?" "Combined roughly $720 million. He exhaled. "Tell legal to begin exit negotiations. Quietly. But we own nearly 12% of their real estate infrastructure. Then sell it in pieces." Miles turned back toward the window overlooking Midtown. The city below bustled like nothing had changed. But everything had. "Sir, there's something else," the associate said, hesitating. "We've received a formal inquiry from the SEC. That caught his attention." Miles spun around. "On what grounds?" "They're citing potential misrepresentation of compliance standards to investors and failure to act on known discriminatory practices." The rod had officially turned radioactive. Across the street in Dominion Ventures' PR suite, Daniel stood in front of a camera crew. The room was small, glass-walled, and pulsing with the nervous energy of a company about to rewrite its industry. He adjusted his jacket, no-tie crisp shirt. Clean, calm. Behind him, a simple banner read, "Dominion Ventures Equity Report, 2020, the Accountability Mandate." A tech assistant clipped a mic to his lapel. Another gave him a countdown with raised fingers. 5, 4, 3. And then with no teleprompter and no script, Daniel began. "For decades," he said, "voice even hospitality has sold us the illusion of inclusion while quietly enforcing the boundaries of exclusion." He paused. Not for drama, but for effect. "We were told that luxury was about refinement, but what they didn't tell us was that refinement was code for conformity, that some were welcome and others were tolerated until they weren't." The video streamed live across LinkedIn, Bloomberg, and Dominion's official site. Daniel continued, "Equity is no longer a social issue. It's an investment issue. Because discrimination is expensive. It costs brands loyalty. It costs them talent. And now it costs them partnerships." Behind the camera, Melissa nodded subtly. Every sentence was hitting like a data-backed uppercut. "At Dominion, we are reallocating $2.8 billion previously committed to expansion projects under review. That money will now fund hospitality ventures committed to transparency, access, and equitable guest experiences." Daniel glanced at the lens. "That includes mandatory bias audits, public accountability frameworks, and a realignment of executive bonuses to include non-discrimination metrics." The comments section exploded. Some called him bold. Others called him dangerous. A few called him revolutionary. But no one looked away. Because this wasn't about a hotel anymore. It was about a reckoning. Back at the Lancaster Grand, the mood had soured from panic to disbelief. Guests were canceling. Influencers were withdrawing endorsements. And a quiet exodus of staff had begun. Not just the ones who were complicit, but those who were exhausted. Tired of being told to smile while swallowing injustice. An emergency staff meeting was called in the Crystal Room, the same space where just a month ago executives toasted to record-breaking bookings. Now the chandeliers flickered above rows of folding chairs. A young black woman named Latasha, head of guest services, stood up. "I've worked here 7 years, and I've watched this place push away talent like me while promoting mediocrity that looked the part." She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. But Daniel Whitaker walked in with more than a black card. He walked in with the receipts. And now the world knows. She sat down to silence. No one applauded. No one argued. They just knew she was right. Because when systemic rot gets exposed, it doesn't matter how many awards are on the wall. It matters how deep the cracks go. And now those cracks were splitting open. $1 billion empire at a time. It started with a whisper in the back corridors of the Lancaster Grand, the kind of hushed hallway conversation that blooms when power begins to crumble. Housekeepers paused their carts near service elevators. Bellhops exchanged glances at the valet station. Baristas in the executive lounge, usually robotic in their professionalism, lingered just long enough to murmur, "Did you hear what he did? They say he owns the company now." "Nah, he pulled a $2.8 billion deal." Just like that, the myths grew faster than the facts. But the impact was the same. Across the hospitality industry, something unprecedented was happening. Employees long silenced by policies, NDAs, and fear of retaliation began speaking up. Not just online, not just on anonymous forums, but in daylight, in staff break rooms, in boardrooms, in resignations. At the corporate headquarters of the parent company that owned the Lancaster Grand and a dozen other luxury hotels, an internal email chain labeled Operation Retention leaked to the press. It revealed what Daniel Whitaker had already hinted at in his audit. This wasn't just about a single hotel, it was a pattern. And that pattern had been normalized through incentives. Managers had been rewarded for brand consistency, a vague term that in practice meant screening out guests who didn't align with the property's image. One whistleblower came forward under the pseudonym Jay Harrison, a former front desk trainer whose testimony struck like lightning. I was told to mark certain guests as discretionary risks if they looked underdressed, even if they had platinum status or black cards. We had code tags. It wasn't about safety. It was about optics. The story aired on a primetime network. Within 24 hours, 6 more former employees came forward corroborating it all. A bartender, a concierge, 2 former assistant managers, even a driver from the hotel's private car fleet. They each described the same subtle system, a culture that hid its bias beneath policies that whispered denials while promoting discrimination. Their statements were calm, factual, and devastating. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitaker refused all interview requests, not out of arrogance, but because the story had outgrown him. He no longer needed to speak. The system was unraveling on its own. In a corner office of a hospitality tech startup called Avanta IQ, Naomi Bell, a black entrepreneur who had pitched bias prevention software to the hotel chain 2 years ago and been rejected, reopened the presentation file she'd archived. She smiled. Now she told her team they'll listen. Calls flooded in, from hotels, from cruise lines, from global chains suddenly realizing that brand equity no longer meant polished marble and white-glove service, it meant social accountability. The shift was seismic. But for Daniel, the real awakening came in an unexpected moment. He was walking through a quiet wing of another hotel in Boston, this one not part of the Lancaster portfolio, but already under Dominion's watch. His role required follow-ups. Audits didn't stop at exposure. They demanded reform. As he walked past the front desk, a young black receptionist caught his eye. She straightened, visibly nervous. He nodded politely. She hesitated, then said softly, "Thank you." Daniel paused. For what? For everything. For showing them we matter. That how they treat us matters. He said nothing at first. Then, "It shouldn't take exposure to earn dignity." She nodded. "But sometimes it does." That moment struck deeper than any audit report or shareholder meeting. Because change doesn't begin in headlines, it begins in hearts. And it spreads when witnesses become believers and believers become advocates. Later that week, Lancaster Grand's boardroom filled for what was supposed to be a recovery strategy session. Instead, they were met with protest. Not from the public, from within. A coalition of longtime employees spanning races, ranks, and departments presented a proposal. Not a list of complaints, a solution. The 5-point equity initiative. 1. Anonymous grievance systems routed through third-party platforms. 2. Mandatory racial bias and empathy training across all staff levels. Quarterly audits by an external ethics committee. Executive bonuses tied to discrimination metrics. A rotating diversity council with actual decision-making power. The board, desperate to salvage reputation, approved it unanimously. But that wasn't the end. Other hotels followed. Smaller chains. Independent brands. Even boutique resorts that had long prided themselves on charm began drafting new frameworks. It wasn't altruism, it was survival. Because the guests were watching now. The staff were awake now. And silence was no longer safety. In a podcast interview that quietly went viral, a former GM of a luxury property in Miami said it best. Daniel Whitaker didn't just cancel a deal. He reset the entire equation of power. He reminded us that money doesn't protect you from judgment, but integrity might. The host asked, "Do you think the industry has changed for good?" The former GM shrugged. "Depends. Will we keep listening or will we wait for the next Whitaker to force us to?" By that point, doing a Whitaker had already become slang in business circles. It meant walking away from a billion-dollar opportunity for the sake of principle. It meant weaponizing calm. It meant refusing to be dismissed. And behind it all were the people who once stood by silent witnesses to injustice. Now they were the loudest voices in the room, and they had Daniel to thank for showing them how. The first to fall was Lancaster Grand's Paris location. Just 6 days after Daniel Whitaker's audit report went public, a wave of cancellations hit their international branches. In France, two major luxury wedding parties withdrew their bookings, citing ethical concerns. A celebrity couple quietly redirected their honeymoon plans to a competitor's eco-luxury brand. And then came the viral moment that solidified the collapse. A video surfaced online, grainy but unmistakable. A black couple, elegantly dressed, stood at the concierge desk of Lancaster Grand Paris. The clerk's voice, caught on audio, said, "I believe the other entrance is more appropriate for service deliveries." The woman blinked. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a reservation confirmation for the presidential suite. The post was captioned, "Still happening. Still Lancaster." It took 12 hours to hit 10 million views. The backlash was immediate. By the time Lancaster's corporate team issued an apology, the damage had metastasized. Other international locations were forced into emergency response meetings. Their PR teams scrambled to sanitize years of customer feedback, suddenly unearthed and shared under the trending hashtag Grand Disrespect. Inside the headquarters of Dominion Ventures, Daniel sat in a glass conference room reviewing live data feeds, charts, cancellations, stock dips, staff attrition spikes. Across the table, his executive assistant, Mia Chen, scrolled through the incoming reports. "Spain just suspended its partnership," she said. "They're issuing an independent audit." Daniel nodded slowly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Singapore's Ministry of Tourism just posted a statement," Mia added. "They're calling for a regional review of all luxury hotels linked to Lancaster." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood crossed to the window and looked out across the skyline, so still, yet beneath it, entire systems were convulsing. "What happens next?" Mia asked, genuinely unsure. Daniel turned. "We let the truth do its work." Elsewhere inside Lancaster's internal Slack channels, leaked via whistleblower panic bloomed like infection. Threads titled "Crisis Containment," "Legal Shield," and "Firewall Protocol" revealed just how deep the dysfunction ran. Executives bickered over whether to suspend Ethan, their original desk clerk, or protect him out of legal fear. Someone even floated the idea of suing Daniel Whitaker for defamation until the legal team clarified, "He has evidence. We'll lose." That same hour, Lancaster's parent company convened an emergency board meeting. The agenda: damage control. What unfolded instead was implosion. Shareholders appeared via encrypted calls. The largest investor group, Silver Ridge Capital, announced its full divestment, citing irreversible reputational erosion. Their statement, later leaked, included one searing line: "We do not invest in companies that treat appearances as currency and people as inconvenience." Another board member, visibly shaken, asked what could be salvaged. The answer came from an unlikely voice: Carla Jennings, the youngest woman ever appointed to Lancaster's board and its sole black executive. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply opened a file titled "Ignored Warnings," 14 months of internal memos, and screen-shared it with the board. Inside were over 30 documented complaints: racial bias, class-based microaggressions, refusal to address internal diversity recommendations, all flagged, all buried. Mr. Whitaker wasn't the problem, Carla said. He was the signal. Silence, then resignation. By day's end, 3 senior executives had stepped down. 2 were removed by vote. The interim CEO, a previously silent figure from the finance department, issued a statement that read less like leadership and more like surrender. "We acknowledge systemic failures. Effective immediately, Lancaster Grand will suspend expansion plans, review leadership across all locations, and submit to independent ethics oversight. We were wrong, and now we begin again if given the chance." But public forgiveness was not easily won. Several hotels faced protest lines outside their doors. Staff wore body cams for accountability. Anonymous employee portals were flooded with stories of years-long mistreatment. One former maid in Chicago posted, "They made us enter through the service corridor even when the guest was my own cousin. Said I'd break the brand illusion." Thank you, Daniel, for breaking theirs. Her message was shared by over 400,000 people in a day. Meanwhile, travel booking platforms like Ethos Trips and Inclusi Stay added a new feature: bias transparency ratings, real-time user-reported metrics of inclusivity and customer dignity. Lancaster Grand scored lowest in its tier. But amid the ashes, something else was growing. In New York, a competing hospitality group invited Daniel to consult on a new ethics-first training protocol. In Chicago, 3 smaller hotels approached Dominion Ventures for help building audit-proof hiring frameworks. And in Atlanta, a startup announced an app for real-time discrimination reporting in luxury spaces. The old system had cracked, but new roots were forming. Daniel remained as ever silent in the public eye. He didn't tweet. He didn't give interviews, but he made moves. He drafted a proposal for a national task force on anti-bias compliance in hospitality. He built it with help from former hotel employees, civil rights attorneys, and even reform-minded board members who had defected from Lancaster. When it was time to present it to Congress, he sent a representative, Naomi Bell. "I'm not the face of this," he told her. "We all are." As she stood on the steps of Capitol Hill holding the proposal, the press tried to make it about Daniel. But she waved them off. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about reconstruction." And across the country, those watching from hotel desks, lounges, kitchens, and guest suites finally understood this was no longer about one man denied respect. It was about an entire industry being asked, what does your luxury really cost? Months after Lancaster Grand's fall from grace, the ripples of the scandal had become waves crashing through the entire hospitality industry. What began as a quiet insult at a front desk was now reshaping policies, re-educating staff, and dismantling long unquestioned norms. But for Daniel Whitaker, the transformation had always been the point, not destruction, but renewal. In Midtown Manhattan, a once vacant building now bore a new name in bronze: the Whitaker Institute for Hospitality Equity. It wasn't a hotel, it was something rare, a cross-industry hub dedicated to reforming how luxury spaces understood power, inclusion, and accountability. Inside, the energy was different. Young hotel trainees of every background sat side by side with corporate executives in workshop rooms filled with natural light. Every desk came with 2 items: a guidebook titled Guest Rights, Dignity, First, and a mirror. The first taught policy. The second reminded every worker that bias often begins with reflection. Daniel walked the halls of the Institute not as an icon, but as a mentor. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was always with precision. "The goal is not perfection," he said during one session. "The goal is awareness. Systems don't become equitable by accident." Elsewhere, Lancaster Grand's remaining branches had become ghostly echoes of their former prestige. In Beverly Hills, the flagship location, once booked solid with celebrities, struggled to fill half its rooms. A new general manager, brought in from outside the original leadership circle, stood before a small team of frontline employees and said quietly, "We start over. Every guest, every shift, every policy." Gone were the gold-plated name tags in the VIP-only elevators. Gone were the legacy contracts shielding managers from review. Instead, body cameras were standard, quarterly anti-bias reviews were mandatory, and feedback platforms were anonymous and public. But most importantly, staff were given a seat at the table. For the first time in the company's history, a bellhop sat on the ethics board. A housekeeper from the Mexico City location drafted the hotel's new dignity code. And Ethan, once a smug gatekeeper of prejudice, had vanished completely from the industry landscape. Not fired, not exiled, just irrelevant. He had become a symbol, not of villainy, but of what happens when institutions protect performance over principle. In Washington, D.C., Naomi Bell presented the first formal recommendations from Daniel's task force before a bipartisan panel of lawmakers. The hearings were not flashy. There were no viral sound bites. But the quiet force behind her words captured the room. "This isn't just about hotels," Naomi said. "It's about any system where access is granted or denied based on assumptions." The recommendations included federally funded bias training programs for all federally subsidized hospitality businesses, penalties for systemic discrimination, uncovered in audits, and incentives for companies that demonstrated transparent diversity practices. A few lobbyists rolled their eyes, but a coalition of veteran travel industry leaders stood behind Naomi, nodding. Across the country, change was no longer theoretical. In Miami, a boutique hotel chain launched its Seen and Safe campaign, where guests received follow-up surveys that asked not just about cleanliness or service, but whether they felt seen, respected, and safe. Their five-star rating jumped within 3 months. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, a startup using AI to identify discriminatory patterns in guest feedback logs raised $40 million in venture funding, with Daniel quietly backing them through Dominion Ventures. He didn't want credit. He wanted change. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline of Atlanta, Daniel stood alone in the lobby of a new property developed in partnership with the Equity Institute. The interior was elegant, minimalist, infused with warmth, not just from design, but from energy. Staff greeted guests by name, but never by assumption. An elderly black couple arrived, their reservation delayed due to a system update. The front desk clerk, young, tattooed, nervous, offered them water, a seat, and an apology without condescension or excuse. He resolved the issue in under 3 minutes and walked them personally to the elevator. Daniel watched in silence. When the clerk returned, he approached him. "You handled that well," Daniel said. "Just doing my job," the clerk replied with a shrug. Daniel smiled faintly. That used to mean something very different. Elsewhere, Lancaster Grand, now under a new name and new ownership, issued a statement of closure for several underperforming branches. The press called it the last retreat of an empire. Investors now reference the Whitaker incident as a turning point in ESG risk assessments for the travel sector. In industry circles, Daniel became a case study. But to him, the greatest outcome wasn't legislation or headlines. It was what happened in the quiet moments of a front desk interaction carried out with dignity, a traveler who no longer had to second-guess how they'd be treated, a room key given without judgment. In those moments, the culture had been rewritten, not with noise, but with consistency. Daniel stood by a window that overlooked a crowded avenue below. A young man walked past the glass laughing with a suitcase in tow. Behind him, a couple argued playfully over directions. An airport shuttle rolled by its side, marked with a new motto, "Luxury is how you make people feel." He didn't need applause. He needed the next generation to never have to go through what he did. And that was already happening. The world finally was learning. In the days that followed the formal acquisition pause and the media storm that fractured Lancaster Grand's reputation, Dominion Ventures quietly began what it had long prepared for: the full-scale audit of the luxury hospitality group. But this was no ordinary audit. It wasn't about spreadsheets, checkboxes, or cursory compliance metrics. Daniel Whitaker had authorized a forensic systemic evaluation, one that would peel back the layers not just of finances, but of culture. A mobile task force assembled in New York. Its members included civil rights attorneys, former hotel managers turned whistleblowers, human behavior analysts, and retired executives with nothing left to prove. At the head sat Naomi Bell, Dominion's lead ethics officer, a woman known for bringing billion-dollar companies to their knees, with nothing but a whiteboard and an airtight timeline. They called it Project Mirror. The first directive was simple: shadow every department from the ground up. No one was told when the audit began. That was part of its power. Employees in Lancaster Grand's remaining open locations were informed only that performance evaluations would take place in the coming quarter. What they didn't know was that undercover auditors had already checked into rooms posed as guests and walked the halls with the quiet observation of people who were not there to be seen, but to see. Daniel had given them a mandate: don't just report what's broken, map the rot. In the Miami branch, a front desk clerk named Lydia, who had worked at the Grand for 8 years, found herself engaging with an older gentleman who seemed confused by the electronic check-in process. She smiled gently, took her time, explained each step, and even offered to walk him to his room when he appeared lost. What she didn't know was that the man was not just a guest. He was Michael Tran, a Dominion auditor and specialist in behavioral bias detection. He marked her interaction with a green flag: proactive empathy. No signs of performance bias. In contrast, at the Chicago branch, another auditor, posing as a business traveler in jeans and a baseball cap, was redirected to the general queue despite holding a platinum guest reservation. Meanwhile, a white couple in designer attire was immediately upgraded and escorted to the executive lounge. The discrepancy was log time-stamped and compared with surveillance footage. This wasn't hearsay. It was evidence. As the audit unfolded, Dominion's analysts began constructing a massive neural map of the Lancaster Grand's behavioral culture, not just from interactions, but from employee training videos, internal memos, disciplinary records, and guest feedback filtered by AI for coded language patterns. The results were staggering. Over 62% of negative guest interactions involving minority clients had been internally classified as guest misunderstanding or non-compliance rather than investigated. Of those, 74% had never been followed up. Many of the employees responsible had received positive performance reviews based on metrics like upholding brand consistency and discretionary judgment. Naomi stood before the audit team one afternoon, pages of data scrolling behind her. They weren't just dismissing people, she said, her voice clear. They were being rewarded for it. Meanwhile, Daniel remained distant from the operations, but he wasn't idle. Back in his Manhattan office, he reviewed incoming data like a general watching a satellite feed. Not to interfere, but to anticipate. He knew this process wasn't about vindication. It was about pattern exposure. And if Dominion could map patterns in one legacy hotel group, it could influence the entire industry. Because the real goal wasn't Lancaster. It was leverage. As data accumulated, so did the weight of the findings. Dominion software flagged repeat offenders within staff rosters across cities. A concierge in Denver who had 6 complaints in 2 years, all involving non-white guests. A manager in Las Vegas who had downgraded single mothers traveling with children, labeling them high risk for noise disturbances. A guest services director in London who repeatedly delayed service requests from Arabic-named guests citing translation issues. Each case was accompanied by digital receipts, call logs, video stills, annotated check-in reports. By the 3rd week of the audit, Dominion had compiled a 470-page preliminary report. Its title was Stark Exclusion by Design, a Cultural Audit of Lancaster Grand. The introduction began with a quote, "The absence of explicit bias does not equal the presence of equity." Meanwhile, on social media, whispers turned to rumblings. Guests who had once been dismissed began speaking up, their accounts amplified by influencers, civil rights advocates, and journalists hungry for substance beyond headlines. Dominion remained silent. They didn't need to fuel the fire. The truth did that on its own. Within Lancaster's boardroom, panic had metastasized. Meetings became daily. Legal briefs thickened by the hour. The new acting CEO, a former regional vice president named Colleen Baker, tried to project calm, but her hands trembled when she wasn't looking. She had read the summary report. It didn't just point fingers. It indicted systems. Lancaster's operating procedure, once lauded as discretionary hospitality, had been reduced to what Daniel had always suspected: an architecture of exclusion. Built subtly, enforced silently, and praised publicly. On a late Friday evening, Naomi emailed Daniel the executive summary, followed by a single sentence: "It's worse than we thought." Daniel sat back in his chair, the Manhattan skyline dark behind him. Worse, yes, but not unexpected. He closed the laptop and turned toward the window, watching as city lights blinked on in organized rows. There was still more to uncover, and Dominion was just getting started. As Dominion's audit team pressed forward with surgical precision, the heart of the Lancaster Grand enterprise began to falter. Not in fire and noise, but in slow internal collapse. The luxury hospitality chain, once the darling of high-end travel magazines and corporate conferences, was being gutted from the inside by something it had never anticipated: accountability. It started subtly. Vendors began missing their calls. A longtime linen supplier in Belgium suddenly reevaluated their partnership. A concierge software provider flagged the group as high risk. In corporate terms, it was the equivalent of being ghosted. No controversy, just cold silence. Inside the company's gleaming headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, the mood had turned from tense to frantic. Legal teams requested emergency consultations with crisis firms. HR began compiling background reports on staff named in the audit. PR consultants reviewed old social media posts for anything that could be weaponized against them. But no matter how quickly they moved, they couldn't stop the bleeding. One of the most dangerous traits of the Lancaster Grand culture had been its overconfidence, believing that its brand prestige was insulation enough that its clientele would remain loyal, and that any backlash could be pacified with a carefully worded press release. That illusion shattered when the board received a confidential email marked "Urgent, Legal Exposure Risk." The attached file contained a data visualization: 5 years of guest complaints mapped against staff profiles. Names lit up in clusters. Repeat offenders were not outliers, they were central nodes in the system. Promotions had coincided with rising complaint volumes, not falling ones. What Daniel and Naomi had uncovered wasn't incidental bias. It was a reward structure rooted in exclusion. Colleen Baker, the interim CEO, stared at the screen into the boardroom with bloodless lips. She'd replaced a man who had quietly stepped down only 3 days earlier, and now the weight of the company's legacy and its unraveling rested on her. "This isn't salvageable," whispered Jerome Klein, Lancaster's general counsel, seated to her left. "Not with Dominion involved. Their audit isn't just internal, it's architectural. They've built a new legal standard before we even knew we were being measured." Colleen didn't answer. Her mind was already racing to the next dilemma: investor meetings. Two major partners had requested early redemptions of their holdings in the hotel group's development arm. If they pulled out financing for the Grand Kyoto and Paris expansions would implode. At 10:17 a.m., a second email arrived, this time from Dominion's legal team. Attached a formal notice of breach of ethics standards. The language was direct, devoid of performative politeness. Dominion Ventures has concluded its preliminary audit and found material evidence of sustained systemic discrimination in guest services, staff development, and operational procedures within Lancaster Grand Properties. This breach violates the equity clauses outlined in our pending partnership agreement. All active negotiations are hereby suspended pending full restitution and independent oversight approval. In one paragraph, the $2.8 billion deal officially died, but that wasn't the most dangerous part of the letter. It was the final line that made everyone in the room still. A redacted version of this report will be submitted to the Equal Rights Compliance Commission within 5 business days. The ERCC. Daniel was leveraging federal review boards. This wasn't just about corporate restructuring anymore. It was about exposure, public, legal, regulatory. Jerome stood up without a word and left the room. By lunchtime, 6 more executives had requested personal leave, and one regional director emailed her resignation, citing unavoidable reputational risks. The structure was still standing, but the foundation was already ash. Meanwhile, Daniel remained invisible to them. He had spoken only once since the audit began, and it was in a closed-door briefing with Dominion's senior team. His words had been simple: "We're not here to shame them. We're here to reveal them to themselves and to the world." He hadn't stepped back into the Lancaster Grand building. He didn't need to. The ripples of his audit moved through their systems like a quiet flood, slipping under thresholds, seeping into closets, unlocking secrets that had long been hidden under expensive rugs and platinum guest tiers. And as the data poured in, Naomi's team was beginning to uncover something even more damning: proof that executive leadership had long known about the bias patterns. There were emails, internal memos, even training evaluations where concerns had been dismissed. A former HR director had once written, "We have to maintain our standard clientele. Let's be careful about changing the tone of the brand too much." That line was included in a training manual used in 14 locations. Dominion's legal team flagged it immediately. Colleen, now aware that the scandal was entering an irreversible phase, attempted one final pivot: transparency. She scheduled a live internal town hall meeting, inviting all department heads to hear her response to the crisis. She planned to announce voluntary restructuring, diversity leadership promotions, and a third-party compliance partnership, anything to show control. But Daniel, watching the internal invite from a Dominion server, simply leaned back in his chair and said, "Too late," because what Lancaster had never understood was that power doesn't shift in town halls or apology letters. It shifts when people stop believing you can't fall. And Lancaster had already fallen. The morning after Dominion's audit findings were internally circulated, the leak began not with a splashy press conference or a bold corporate whistleblower, but with a single screenshot posted to an anonymous Reddit thread. The image showed a redacted paragraph from Dominion's breach notice. It was blurry, hastily cropped, and accompanied by a 7-word caption: "This is just the beginning. Watch this." Within hours, it went viral. By mid-afternoon, hashtags like Lancaster Audit, Black Card Bias, and Hotelgate trended across social media. What had started as a silent corporate reckoning was now unfolding on the public stage, watched by millions with popcorn in hand and fury in their hearts. Screenshots of guest complaints began surfacing, some public, others likely leaked from inside the company. Photos of Ethan, the smirking desk clerk, were reposted side by side with user testimonies alleging racial profiling and microaggressions at various Lancaster properties around the world. Then came the video. A shaky phone-recorded clip from the hotel's lobby the night Daniel was humiliated, captured by another guest, emerged on Twitter. In it, Ethan's mocking tone could be heard clearly, and Daniel's silent composure framed him not just as a professional, but as a man with dignity under fire. The final moment when Daniel slid his business card across the desk and turned away hit viewers with quiet power. He didn't raise his voice, one user tweeted. He raised the stakes. In less than 24 hours, the post had over 4 million views. Traditional news outlets were slow to catch up. But by day, two CNN, Reuters, and The Guardian all ran variations of the same headline. Luxury hotel chain rocked by allegations of systemic discrimination following viral incident. Daniel Whitaker's name became synonymous with a new form of corporate justice, silent, strategic, and surgical. Unlike the performative outrage of a social media boycott, his was a methodical demolition carried out from the inside, built on data, legal architecture, and ethical leverage. What made the story even more gripping to the public was the sheer contrast: a billion-dollar deal undone not by protesters outside the building, but by the man they tried to humiliate inside it. On national talk shows, anchors dissected every frame of the now infamous clip. Panels debated whether Lancaster's response had been swift enough or too little too late. One commentator, a former executive from a competing hotel chain, said bluntly, "They didn't just discriminate. They did it with the kind of entitlement that only comes when you believe the world will never hold you accountable." Lancaster Grand's attempts at damage control collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny. Their official statement, issued on muted cream-colored letterhead, read like a template: regret, commitment to learning, working with consultants. The public wasn't having it. Their Instagram page, once filled with images of rooftop champagne and silk-sheeted suites, turned into a war zone. Every post was met with floods of comments. One read, "You don't need consultants, you need a conscience." And while the PR team scrambled inside, the company panic turned into cannibalism. Board members threw executives under the bus. Regional directors blamed headquarters. Managers demanded HR reassess which employees had been promoted in recent years. No one wanted to own the rot, and yet the audit trail traced it all: emails, decision memos, internal Slack messages riddled with dog whistles and dismissals. Naomi's team at Dominion had built an evidence matrix that was airtight. Daniel, for his part, had said nothing to the public, no interviews, no statements. He had told Naomi and the team one thing: let them talk. We act. So while Lancaster reeled, Dominion pivoted. They began a quiet campaign to reform the industry. Using the fallout from Lancaster as both case study and cautionary tale, they approached competitors, Marquesa Hotels, Sylvania Group, Horizon Resorts, with a simple offer: learn from their collapse or face your own. The pitch wasn't fear-mongering, it was future-proofing. Dominion offered compliance infrastructure, third-party audit support, and digital systems to detect bias at the point of service. Their clients would be able to track treatment disparities in real time before the next Daniel ever had to walk away from a desk in silence. Some companies balked, but most didn't. Within a week, 3 major hotel chains signed letters of intent. Naomi's phone rang nonstop. Daniel's inbox flooded with messages from CEOs, advocacy groups, and former victims of similar treatment. One message stood out. It was from a young woman in Atlanta who had once been denied entry into a luxury hotel lobby while waiting for her mother, a housekeeper. Her words were simple: "Thank you for showing them we aren't invisible." Daniel read it once, then again. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Back at the Lancaster Grand, the lobby had changed. The chandeliers still glimmered. The marble still gleamed, but the guests had thinned. The hush wasn't elegance anymore, it was caution. Staff were told to be extra courteous, but it wasn't hospitality. It was fear. In the break room, Ethan's name was only whispered, and above the reception desk, a small silver plaque had been added: "All guests are welcome. Respect is not optional." No one spoke of who ordered it, but everyone knew why. The tremors that began at the Lancaster Grand had turned into a full-blown corporate earthquake. By the time the industry caught up, Daniel's silent strike had already sparked a reckoning beyond the walls of a single hotel. What had once been dismissed as an isolated lapse in judgment was now recognized as a signal and indictment of the structures that had protected bias under the illusion of exclusivity. And as the cracks in Lancaster's empire widened, they exposed more than just a broken service model. They revealed a culture of systemic rot. Within 72 hours, travel influencers, once eager to tag Lancaster Grand, in their glittering posts began deleting endorsements. A viral compilation video titled "When Luxury Turns to Prejudice" began circulating, featuring dozens of travelers recounting eerily similar stories. Most hadn't even realized their experiences had been discriminatory until they saw Daniel's story. A black couple in Chicago recalled being told the rooftop bar was at capacity only to watch 3 white guests walk in minutes later. A South Asian executive described being randomly selected for an ID scan, despite being the keynote speaker at a conference hosted inside the very same hotel. A Hispanic woman recounted being questioned twice about the validity of her platinum loyalty membership. The stories kept coming, and with them came lawsuits. Civil rights organizations, including the Equal Access Coalition and Urban Equity Fund, filed formal complaints with the Department of Justice. While the legal process would take time, the reputational collapse was immediate. Stockholders started demanding answers. Lancaster Hospitality Group, the parent company overseeing 36 high-end properties, called an emergency board meeting. Inside the conference room in their Midtown Manhattan headquarters, the air was thick with panic. "We need to contain this," said Marianne Royce, VP of Brand Relations, tapping furiously through Twitter threads on her tablet. "This is no longer just a PR issue, it's an existential one." "Define contain," muttered one of the directors, "because short of rewinding time, I don't think we're putting this genie back in the bottle." The group fell into a familiar cycle of blame, one part self-preservation, one part strategic denial. But amidst the chaos, a quieter voice emerged. It was Mark Enders, the CFO. He rarely spoke unless numbers were involved. Now his voice carried more than data, it carried resignation. "We've lost the expansion deal. We're hemorrhaging bookings across 8 flagship locations. Our credit rating just took a hit, and Dominion Ventures is circulating the audit with partner brands across Europe. We are not in damage control. We are in free fall." The silence that followed wasn't shocked. It was numb, because deep down they all knew. This wasn't about one card swipe, one smirk, or one ignorant employee. It was about a system that saw certain guests as props in its performance of luxury, but never as equals. Back at Dominion, Naomi stood in the center of a quiet war room. Large digital displays tracked trends, stock movements, and media sentiment. Daniel had just returned from a private debrief with 2 senior executives from a rival hotel group. They wanted Dominion's help to preempt what Lancaster had failed to contain. Naomi, glancing at the screen, turned to Daniel. "We're not just auditing anymore. We're setting the standard." Daniel nodded. "Then we make it count." They launched what they called the Equity Index Protocol, a proprietary tool measuring internal disparities in customer treatment across the hospitality industry. Hotels were rated not just on service quality, but on behavioral parity, how different demographics were treated under identical circumstances. They offered it as a service, but also as a warning. The message was clear. If you won't fix it, someone will expose it. Within 2 weeks, Lancaster Grand's most iconic property in Paris saw a 40% drop in reservations. A high-profile celebrity canceled her wedding reception at the Los Angeles location. Global luxury brands began reconsidering partnerships, and then came the internal collapse. Inboxes inside the company exploded with resignation emails. The VP of Operations in Europe stepped down after leaked memos revealed he'd ignored previous complaints flagged by staff. Lancaster's head of HR was suspended pending investigation into suppression of racial grievance filings. In London, a group of former employees filed a class action lawsuit for wrongful dismissal tied to race-based profiling complaints. The iceberg Daniel had struck wasn't just big. It had always been submerged, its visible tip masking the full scale of institutional failure. One morning, Daniel received a call from a former front desk manager at Lancaster's Dubai branch. She was Indian, and she'd left after being demoted for lack of cultural fit. She had read his name in the news, followed the story obsessively, and now her voice trembled on the line. "You don't know what this means to people like us," she said. "We were always told to smile, to serve, to not make noise. But you made silence impossible." Daniel thanked her, then sat quietly at his desk. It wasn't victory, it was vindication. Not because they had brought down a giant, but because they had revealed that the giant was built on sand all along. By the 3rd week, Lancaster Hospitality's CEO Robert Crane resigned under pressure from the board. The company issued a statement pledging a complete structural overhaul, promising independent oversight, mandatory bias training, and the appointment of an external ethics chief. But the world had moved on. They weren't waiting for apologies anymore. They were watching who rebuilt and how. Daniel, meanwhile, had begun working with lawmakers on policy reform proposals for the hospitality sector, beginning with an ambitious national registry that would allow anonymous reports of service discrimination to be publicly visible in real time. The system wasn't broken. It had been built that way, but now it was being rebuilt brick by ethical brick. The Lancaster Grand's executive boardroom, once the setting for champagne toasts and five-star expansion meetings, now bore the heavy air of crisis. Around the sleek mahogany table, once symbols of stability, sat a war-torn team of executives, each one bearing the weight of a storm they had failed to predict. What had started as a single incident, a laugh, a card, a smirk, had metastasized into a corporate infection, spreading from inbox to inbox, from boardroom to broadcast. Daniel Whitaker was nowhere in the room, yet his presence hovered like a verdict. Overnight, the social media wildfire had charred through the hotel's pristine brand image. Hashtags like Black Card Backlash and Hospitality. Hypocrisy trended globally. Influential voices in finance, travel, and justice industries condemned what they saw as a perfect case study of systemic prejudice disguised as policy. The Lancaster Grand had spent millions constructing its identity as a haven for the world's elite. But now, no amount of architectural beauty could shield them from the fallout of character collapse. Across from the CEO sat Lorraine Chen, the brand's VP of International Affairs, her expression caught between fury and fatigue. She had warned them months ago that the audit from Dominion Ventures would not be cursory. She had flagged anonymous reports of front desk misconduct. She had asked for training of its bias reduction protocols, cross-cultural PR consultancy. But like Daniel at the desk, she had been met with polite condescension and brushed aside. "Legal's on the call," said one assistant, placing a tablet on the table with a trembling hand. "They're drafting responses to the investor withdrawal letters." "Too late," murmured CFO Preston Meyer. His tie loosened and voice frayed. "By the time we publish anything, we'll be 5 headlines behind. This isn't just bad optics. This is capital flight." The room turned silent again, each leader slowly realizing the trajectory they were on. But the true sting came when the door opened and in stepped a junior associate from Dominion Ventures, Carla James, mid-30s, sharply dressed in a minimalist gray pantsuit carrying a leather folder. No security, no entourage, just calm confidence. "I have a message from Mr. Whitaker," she said without preamble. The chairman tried to rise, clearing his throat. "Is he open to speaking directly? There may have been misunderstandings." Carla placed the folder on the table without a smile. "He's not. He's moved on. But before he did, he wanted you to have these." Inside the folder were printed screenshots of internal emails, staff jokes about undesirable clientele, a Slack thread mocking names on premium booking lists, and most damning of all, a directive from mid-management to use discretion with high-tier guests who may not visually match standard expectations. It was the smoking gun, the policy behind the prejudice. "He thought these might help you understand," Carla added quietly. "It wasn't about Ethan. It wasn't about the lobby. It was about the culture." Preston's face went pale. The documents were date-stamped, employee named, and impossible to refute. Lorraine closed her eyes slowly, feeling the gravity settle deep in her chest. This wasn't negligence. This was rot. Dominion Ventures has decided, Carla continued, not only to cancel the $2.8 billion expansion project, but to redirect it toward a partnership with Meridian Equity and their new inclusive hospitality fund. It's already been announced. A collective gasp rippled through the room. "You've been replaced," Carla concluded, and without another word she turned and walked out, her heels tapping against the marble like a metronome, counting down the brand's final breaths of credibility. Back at Dominion's New York office, Daniel sat in a quiet conference room overlooking the city skyline. He had spent the morning finalizing the Meridian partnership with his executive team. The funds were being reallocated not just to build something new, but to create a model that redefined what hospitality meant. It wasn't revenge, it was re-engineering. He didn't speak much that morning. He didn't need to. Every decision had already been seeded through weeks of foresight, data analysis, and composure under fire. While the Lancaster Grand had scrambled to delete comments and rehearse press statements, he had restructured an entire deal flow overnight. The black card they mocked had become the scalpel that severed the deal, and no one could stitch it back. As he stood by the window sipping coffee, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Lancaster Grand loses flagship partnership. Amid racial bias, scandal, audit, sparks industry reckoning. Below it, a smaller headline caught his eye. Anonymous investor buys minority stake in new inclusive hotel brand. He smiled slightly, then set the phone down and turned back to his team. "We're not just pulling funding," he said quietly. "We're building the future." Outside, the city moved as it always had, hustling, forgetting, replacing. But deep within its skyline, a silent shift had occurred. The story of a single card and a single moment of disrespect had grown into a blueprint for systemic change. And Part 15 was only the beginning of their fall. By noon, the financial media had transformed the Lancaster Grand scandal into front-page headlines. It wasn't just a story about a botched interaction, it had metastasized into a symbol of institutional failure. Stock analysts on business networks debated whether the incident reflected a broader trend of tone-deaf leadership in legacy luxury brands. The hotel's parent company, Veritas Hospitality Group, watched in disbelief as their share price dropped 12% by early afternoon, and still falling. Inside the Lancaster Grand, the mood was no longer defensive, it was full retreat. Staff whispered in corners, dodging questions from panicked guests. Some influencers who had previously flaunted their stays on social media now posted condemnations and removed tagged photos. One TikTok influencer even went viral for dramatically canceling her reservation mid-live stream, shouting into her phone, "We don't support institutions that humiliate Black excellence." Daniel Whitaker, meanwhile, remained characteristically silent. Not a single post, no interviews, no soundbite. His silence was surgical. It was the kind of quiet that made power feel heavier. Behind the scenes, however, Dominion's legal and investment divisions were already reshaping the future. Not just by divesting from Lancaster, but by launching an initiative that would shake the luxury hospitality industry to its core. The initiative was simple on paper, but radical in practice. An ethical accreditation framework for premium hotel chains based on racial equity, inclusion metrics, and transparent policy enforcement standards. It wasn't government mandated, it wasn't regulatory, but it had teeth. The reason Dominion wasn't acting alone. Daniel had already secured alignment with 5 major equity funds, 2 airline alliances, and 3 top-tier global booking platforms. Together, they would only book and recommend hotels that met the accreditation's minimum standards. It was a move that redirected billions of dollars, not through protest, but through redirection of capital. And Dominion was the architect. Back at the Lancaster Grand, no one saw it coming. They were too busy reacting to the PR wildfire. They didn't know that the floor underneath them was about to collapse from a different direction entirely. It started with a memo. An email marked urgent circulated to all department heads. The title, Suspension of Preferred Listings on Jet Global Aero Trust and First Class Finder. The body of the email confirmed it. 3 of the largest VIP booking platforms were removing Lancaster Grand and all Veritas properties from their recommended and rewards packages. Effective immediately. This wasn't about reviews. This wasn't about politics. It was about business. And Veritas had just become bad business. The hotel's director of sales, Melissa Ruiz, stood frozen in her office. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, rereading the same paragraph 4 times. The loss of those listings didn't just mean prestige, it meant exposure. Bookings, corporate packages, executive retreats. She opened a spreadsheet to quantify the damage, but her hands shook too much to type. Downstairs in the lobby, Ethan, the man who had mocked Daniel's card, sat stiffly in a quiet meeting room, flanked by HR and legal representatives. A document lay in front of him. It wasn't termination yet. It was administrative leave pending investigation. But everyone knew what that meant. "You may retain counsel," the HR officer said quietly. Ethan stared blankly at the table. The smugness, the subtle tilt of superiority that had defined his posture just 48 hours earlier gone. What he had assumed was a harmless jab at a pretender had turned into a public indictment of the entire hotel's culture. It wasn't just the joke, it was the assumption underneath it. He finally broke his silence. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered. "That's exactly the problem," the HR rep said. "It shouldn't have mattered." Meanwhile, in a nearby luxury suite high above the city, Daniel met quietly with Ava Boone, Dominion's lead strategist on ethics-driven investments. The skyline stretched endlessly outside the windows, but inside the room, the focus was precise. "Jet Global confirmed their alignment," Ava said, passing over a digital tablet. So did Black Ledger and Ascension Fund. That brings us to 10 institutional partners. Daniel nodded. In the press, Ava smiled faintly, still chasing a statement. But your silence is fueling the narrative. They're calling it the quiet boycott. Investors are calling it smart. You're becoming a blueprint. He didn't react. What about Meridian's rollout? The first 3 pilot hotels will be announced Friday, Ava replied. Each one tied to a local diversity initiative with full transparency reporting. Daniel leaned back slightly in the armchair. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't vengeful. He was focused. Focused on building something better. The destruction of Lancaster was never the goal, it was just a consequence of unchecked arrogance. He opened his laptop and brought up a dashboard of metrics. Sentiment scores, consumer trust indexes, partner engagement charts. The numbers told the story better than any article could, and they all pointed to one fact the tide had turned. Lancaster's downfall was no longer just a scandal. It had become a case study, and Daniel Whitaker had just redrawn the map of ethical capital. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the Lancaster Grand's once pristine facade, the building no longer radiated luxury. It pulsed with anxiety. Inside the executive offices on the 22nd floor were in disarray. What used to be a bastion of composed leadership now echoed with hushed arguments and door slams. The boardroom, designed to impress with its gold inlays and panoramic views, had become a containment unit for reputational hemorrhage. Veritas Hospitality CEO Marlene Astor stood at the head of the conference table, arms crossed, watching her leadership team unravel. The screen behind her projected a single slide from the morning's emergency briefing, 2.8b, expansion project terminated. No one dared speak. The air was dense with the collective failure to read the cultural moment, to anticipate the storm Daniel Whitaker had quietly unleashed. We built a brand on heritage and exclusivity, Marlene said flatly, her voice razor sharp. But somehow we allowed that exclusivity to become synonymous with discrimination. And now we're bleeding from every channel, financial, operational, reputational. She gestured toward the CFO. What's the latest? Stephen Clark, usually composed, was visibly pale. We've lost 11 corporate accounts. Events are canceling. 5 of our top-tier clients are demanding refund clauses based on ethics provisions. And we're being audited by 2 of our own investors. Internal review flagged this location as high risk weeks ago, but it was ignored. Marlene didn't respond. She simply stared down the length of the table at her VP of Guest Services, who had personally recommended Ethan for a permanent position after his charming guest control during a high-profile gala. The irony was nauseating now. Downstairs, the atmosphere wasn't much better. Several longtime guests had checked out early. Others were asking pointed questions. Is it true your staff racially profiled a Black executive? Why haven't you issued a formal apology? The concierge team was instructed to deflect all inquiries with pre-approved talking points. But those talking points weren't holding. A guest relations manager named Carla, who had worked at Lancaster for 7 years, pulled aside her colleague near the elevators. This place feels cursed, she whispered. It's like we're pretending we're still elite, but everyone's watching us crumble in real time. By the time the evening shift started, reporters had taken positions across the street with telephoto lenses. One had even bribed a former employee to leak internal training documents, including outdated behavior guidelines riddled with vague policies like maintain visual harmony with clientele. The blowback wasn't confined to Lancaster's walls. Online, the hospitality industry was being dragged into the spotlight. Boycott Veritas trended for a 3rd consecutive day. Black travel groups issued warnings to their members. One post read, if they can humiliate a man with a black card in a $2, 8B deal in his pocket, what chance do the rest of us have? At the same time, Dominion's silent campaign was activating in full force. Daniel had never planned to destroy the Lancaster Grand. But now that the rot had surfaced, he was determined to ensure no other institution could hide behind chandeliers and marble. He stood quietly at a private terminal in the city's secondary airport, watching flight boards shuffle while Ava Boone walked him through the next stage. We've onboarded the equity scoring framework to all 3 hospitality funds, Ava explained. They're already integrating the metrics into their investment screening. No hotel scoring below 85% on racial equity and bias resolution protocols will receive funding. Daniel nodded, processing the data like a general scanning a battle map. What about staffing? Ava smiled slightly. We've connected with two Black-owned HR platforms. They're deploying recruitment and training modules to pilot hotels under Meridian. Real-time incident escalation, internal equity audits, and anonymous employee feedback pipelines all embedded. The model is scalable. Daniel exhaled not with relief, but with readiness. Across the globe, emails were going out. Letters of disinterest in legacy deals, notifications of portfolio restructuring. Behind each digital transmission was a seed of new policy. Daniel wasn't trying to win the press war. He was remapping power quietly, methodically, with every new partner onboarded. But perhaps the most pivotal call of the day came not from an ally, but from an adversary. A private number. Daniel answered it with his usual calm. Mr. Whitaker, this is Anthony Devlin, General Counsel for Veritas Hospitality. There was a pause. I assume this isn't a courtesy call, Daniel said evenly. Frankly, no, Devlin replied. We're requesting a closed-door dialogue. The board is willing to discuss settlement terms related to the canceled expansion project. Daniel considered the offer, the unspoken desperation behind the words. I don't need a settlement, Mr. Devlin, he said after a moment. I need a structural overhaul. And until that begins, there's nothing to discuss. The line went quiet. Then would you at least consider a formal mediation? Daniel's tone didn't waver. You had the chance to listen. You chose to sneer. Now you can wait. He ended the call. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was earned. The following week unfolded like a corporate fever dream. Across Veritas Hospitality's global offices, uncertainty seeped into every floor, every cubicle, every whispered hallway conversation. In the London branch, HR was forced to launch an immediate internal probe into all past complaints. In Dubai, an investor from a sovereign wealth fund froze a $300 million reinvestment round, citing unacceptable reputational risk. In Singapore, a luxury development partner abruptly canceled its equity agreement. Each rupture traced back to the same name, Daniel Whitaker. But Daniel wasn't watching the fall for satisfaction. He was watching it like an engineer might observe a collapsing bridge, analyzing every weak bolt, every stress fracture, every design flaw. No one else had taken seriously until it failed under pressure. He stood in a small glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline, reviewing a briefing with Dominion's ethics and operations teams. Beside him, Ava Boone pulled up a live compliance heat map. Each region was color-coded based on risk factors, employee turnover, discrimination, complaints, whistleblower, inactivity. The Lancaster Grand location glowed in a deep, alarming red. This, Ava said, pointing to the screen, is the result of decades of unchecked behavior. They built a brand, but never checked if the foundation was poisoned. Daniel nodded once. Then we redesigned the foundation. They had already begun rolling out Dominion's Invisible Metrics initiative. Unlike traditional audits that focused on sales and satisfaction, this model tracked respect, how it was granted, how it was denied, and what patterns emerged in between. Staff interview data was anonymized, cross-referenced with behavioral analytics, and overlaid with incident frequency. From that came what Dominion called the tolerance index. Lancaster scored 31 out of 100. And they weren't the worst. Ava switched screens. This is the part no one expects. When you change the way value is measured, entire systems start to fall apart. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quiet but exact. Let them fall. At that same moment on the 22nd floor of Lancaster Grand, the executive team was attempting to hold together the illusion of authority. Marlene Astor sat at the end of the table, lips pursed, reviewing a list of remaining strategic partners. We have to salvage the Florence project, she said. If that goes, our entire EMEA leverage goes with it. Stephen, the CFO, looked exhausted. We have less than a week before they walk. They want a full assurance statement, new diversity board appointments, and confirmation that Ethan Callaway is permanently barred from any rehiring pathways. Fine. Do it, she snapped. But the board members around her knew something darker was looming. Dominion Ventures had already become the new gold standard in executive equity enforcement. Their reports weren't just internal. They were starting to show up in government advisory committees and institutional investor guidelines. A bad equity score wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was corporate exile. And Lancaster wasn't just bleeding credibility anymore. It was under siege. Meanwhile, Daniel arrived quietly at a small university in upstate New York. He had agreed to speak privately to a group of business ethics graduate students. No press, no photos, just words. The classroom was small, maybe 30 seats. He stood at the front, hoodie back on the same one he wore the day Ethan laughed at him. I'm not here to talk about revenge, he began. I'm here to talk about systems, about how arrogance hides in processes, how bias can be camouflaged inside protocol, and how power isn't about yelling. It's about what you do when no one sees you move. A hand went up. A student in the back. Sir, did you ever feel like walking away instead of fighting back? Daniel's answer came fast. Of course. Every day. But walking away means someone else walks into that fire, and next time they might not have a card or a title or the legal backup. They might just get crushed. Silence. And then a long building applause, not for drama, but for clarity. Back at Dominion headquarters, Ava Boone watched a new alert hit her screen. An internal leak from Veritas. A board member had forwarded a confidential memo to the press. The headline read, Lancaster's Empire on the Brink, Internal Memos. Reveal panic, not policy. Ava forwarded the alert to Daniel without comment. He responded in seconds, prepare the Obsidian proposal. This wasn't just about Lancaster anymore. Dominion had been preparing to launch a full-scale hospitality competitor, one rooted in transparency, inclusivity, and data-backed operations. The name was simple. Obsidian, hard, polished. Dark by nature, sharp by design. Obsidian wasn't a revenge play. It was a replacement. They already had the funding, the infrastructure blueprints, the pilot properties. All they needed was the moment to strike. And this was that moment. As Daniel closed his laptop and stepped out into the street, a passerby stopped him. Hey, the man said, looking vaguely familiar. Aren't you the guy from that hotel video? Daniel's expression didn't change. I'm just a man who values respect. The man nodded. Well, you made a lot of us rethink things. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. Some systems fall, others are built better. The Obsidian launch wasn't just coming, it was accelerating. Inside Dominion's strategy war room, a full floor sealed from the rest of headquarters plans were no longer theoretical. Floor plans were being finalized. Hiring models were being tested. Brand positioning had entered phase 3. Daniel walked the length of the darkened room, his steps silent over the black marble tiles, as his executive team finalized the rollout protocol for Obsidian's first flagship location, not in New York, not in San Francisco, but in Florence, the same city where Veritas had tried to reassert its European dominance, the same market they were now struggling to hold on to after Daniel quietly convinced 2 top real estate developers to reconsider their hotel affiliations. We go live in Florence first, Daniel said, his voice cutting through the hushed room like a scalpel. We show the world what hospitality looks like when it doesn't flinch at someone's skin name or accent. We make luxury synonymous with dignity. His team nodded, understanding that Obsidian wasn't just about disruption, it was about redefinition. At the same moment, Veritas board members sat hunched in a windowless crisis room, phones ringing every 10 minutes with more fallout. Sponsors for their signature gala event had pulled out, citing reputational concerns. A longtime legal partner declined to renew their retainer. Even the National Tourism Board had quietly removed Lancaster Grand from its official promotional materials. And still, no one from Veritas dared to reach out to Daniel. They knew better. He wasn't playing for apologies. He was playing for transformation. Back at Dominion, Ava Boone received a new update. A classified equity compliance document leaked anonymously showed that Veritas's internal diversity and inclusion committee had not met in over 14 months. Not once. The document included excuses, calendar conflicts, and shifting priorities, but the facts spoke for themselves. Daniel read the report in silence. Then he slid it into the presentation deck for Obsidian's Florence pitch. Don't say anything, he told Ava. Let them explain that in front of a camera. Meanwhile, Lancaster Grand's hotel lobby was experiencing a slow but unmistakable exodus. Loyal clientele, high net worth individuals who typically returned season after season had vanished. Rooms sat vacant. Bellhops stood idle. The general manager's office, once a revolving door of handshakes and investor meetings, was now locked, its windows dark. In a symbolic blow, a 5-star travel magazine quietly removed the Lancaster Grand from its annual Elite Collection guide. It was a quiet erasure but devastating. And then the death knell came. The International Equity Consortium, a global watchdog that had only recently begun rating companies on systemic inclusivity performance, released its first public blacklist. Veritas Hospitality ranked number 3. A line in the report read, "Persistent failure to address embedded discrimination at both operational and executive levels." Public incident with Dominion Ventures confirms ongoing disregard for systemic accountability. The next morning, Obsidian's first Florence ad hit digital airwaves. Black background, white lettering, no music, just one line. "Luxury is not a mirror, it's a door." The Obsidian logo appeared beneath it. And for the first time in months, Dominion's inbox was flooded, not with complaints or requests for clarification, but with applications. Over 15,000 resumes in the first 48 hours. People from all over the world, hospitality veterans, corporate refugees, startup innovators wanted in, not just to work, but to build. Daniel walked into Ava's office mid-afternoon holding a list of early investor interest. 3 of Veritas's former capital partners had reached out quietly expressing support for Obsidian's vision. Some offered money, others offered real estate. He placed the list on Ava's desk. "We won't take them," he said. Ava looked up. "Even if it gives us faster reach." He shook his head. "Obsidian doesn't grow on the ruins of opportunism. We build this clean, or we don't build it at all." Later that evening, Daniel returned home the first quiet night in weeks. His penthouse overlooked the skyline, but the view didn't hold his focus. Instead, he watched a video on mute, one that had gone viral earlier that day. It was a clip from a hospitality podcast where a former Veritas executive, now anonymously interviewed, spoke candidly about the internal rot. "I knew Ethan," the voice said. "He was just the symptom. The disease that was our culture. We were taught that image mattered more than respect, that money could fix any PR fire. But we were wrong. We built on sand, and Daniel Whitaker showed us what happens when a storm hits." Daniel closed the video and sat in silence. It had never been about Ethan, or even about Lancaster Grand. It had always been about a belief that some people belonged and others didn't. That power could excuse prejudice. That wealth could mask rot. And now that belief was crumbling. Back at Dominion, Faya and the legal team prepared the final filings to register Obsidian Gate as an international hospitality entity. The paperwork would be done before midnight. It would become public record by morning. But to Daniel, none of it felt like an ending. It felt like the beginning. At precisely 900 a.m., as the city stirred awake beneath a pale gold sunrise, a digital headline pulsed across every major business platform. "Obsidian Gate officially launches hospitality enters a new era." The article accompanying it was brief, but every sentence was razor-sharp, founded by Dominion Ventures. "Obsidian Gate promises more than luxury, it promises reform. Rooted in dignity, fueled by equity, and designed to challenge decades of quiet exclusion in the hospitality industry." Meanwhile, the Lancaster Grand sat beneath the same sky, its ornate facade now a shell of the arrogance it once radiated. The valet stand was empty. The lobby cafe had stopped restocking its pastries. And in a painful final blow, Veritas Hospitality's flagship location had been officially downgraded from 5 stars to 3 by the International Alliance of Hospitality Standards. Daniel Whitaker, however, wasn't watching from the sidelines. He stood in Obsidian's Florence flagship that same morning, surrounded by final setup crews and digital designers syncing the first AI-driven concierge system. The scent of oak and Italian leather drifted through the air. Marble counters gleamed beneath natural skylight. And unlike the hotels he had audited for years, this one wasn't curated for appearance. It was designed for experience. He walked through the grand entryway, stopping to test the biometric welcome kiosk. It greeted him by name. Not by status, not by assumption, just by data and dignity. He smiled faintly. Across the lobby, Ava was giving a media tour to 3 international journalists. One of them asked, "Do you think Obsidian can really change the industry? Or will this be just another luxury brand with good PR?" Ava's answer was swift. "Obsidian doesn't change the industry by existing," she said. "It changes the industry by being impossible to ignore." By noon, bookings were already flooding in, not just from the usual clientele, global investors, celebrities, or legacy partners, but from young professionals, social entrepreneurs, and conscious travelers who had watched Daniel's story unfold online. They weren't buying rooms, they were buying belief. Back in New York, a letter landed on the desk of Veritas Hospitality's interim CEO. It was short, unsigned, but unmistakable in tone. Your empire collapsed not because of exposure, but because of arrogance. Fix your culture or fade. No return address. They didn't need one. The echo of Daniel Whitaker's name was enough. In the days that followed, Obsidian's launch dominated conversations. Travel influencers posted reaction videos. Equity-focused podcasts dissected Daniel's quiet strategy. University business schools began using the Veritas collapse as a case study titled, "When Brand Becomes Blind." But Daniel himself remained silent. He didn't sit for interviews. He didn't write an op-ed. He didn't gloat. He simply moved forward, brick by brick, policy by policy, ensuring that the foundation beneath Obsidian would never mirror the hypocrisy of the system it replaced. On the final night of opening week, Daniel stood alone in the Obsidian penthouse suite, gazing out over the Arno River. City lights shimmered on the surface like constellations. Behind him, the room was filled with sleek minimalism and calming silence. A staff member entered softly, holding an envelope. "This came in today." "From Geneva," she said, placing it on the table. He waited until she left before opening it. Inside was a formal invitation to speak at the Global Hospitality Summit. Headline panel, "Subject Dignity as Design, a New Blueprint for Power." Daniel folded the paper neatly and slid it into a drawer. He didn't need a stage. He'd already delivered the loudest message possible through action. But what stayed with him that night wasn't the collapse of Veritas or the rise of Obsidian. It was the moment weeks earlier when he had stood at the Lancaster Grand front desk, black card in hand, and heard the clerk's sneer echo across a marble lobby. That was the moment they tried to make him feel small, and that was the last time they ever would. Because power doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it wears silence, precision, patience. Sometimes it waits for the world to underestimate it, then rewrites the terms of the entire game. Daniel turned off the lights and sat by the window hoodie draped across the chair behind him. No performance. No performance necessary. He knew what Obsidian stood for now. Not revenge, redesign. Not dominance, reinvention. And for those who still laughed at black cards, at hoodies, at names they couldn't pronounce, there would be other stories, other quiet battles. But Obsidian had drawn the line. The game had changed forever. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more narratives that expose injustice and celebrate quiet revolutions. Comment below. What would you have done in Daniel's place? And don't forget, sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one rewriting history.